Democracy Now! This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman as we turn to the life of the veteran U.S. diplomat Richard Holbrooke, who died Monday night at the age of 69 after suffering from a torn aorta. At the time of his death, Holbrooke was serving as President Obama's special envoy to Pakistan and Afghanistan. He'd served under every Democratic president since John F. Kennedy. He recently described the war in Afghanistan as one of the hardest diplomatic assignments he's faced.
There's no Ho Chi Minh, there's no Slobodan Milosevic, there's no Palestinian Authority. There is a widely dispersed group of people that we roughly call the enemy.
On Monday, State Department spokesperson P.J. Crowley described Holbrooke as a peacemaker and highlighted his role in brokering the 1995 Dayton peace accords that ended the war in Bosnia.
It is, of course, a very sad day here at the State Department. We have lost one of our own and a legendary figure in Richard Holbrooke, who could fill a room, including this one, as he did many times, and took great pleasure in engaging the press in advancing whatever it was he was working on, whether it was peace in the Balkans, peace in Congo as UN ambassador, or most recently peace in South Asia in the context of Afghanistan and Pakistan.
While tributes have been pouring in for Richard Holbrooke, little attention has been paid to his role in implementing and backing U.S. policies that killed thousands of civilians. As Assistant Secretary of State in the Carter administration, Holbrooke oversaw weapon shipments to the Indonesian military as it killed a third of East Timor's population. In 1980, he played a key role in the Carter administration's support for a South Korean military crackdown and a pro-democracy uprising in the city of Gwangju that killed hundreds of people. Details of Holbrooke's role in East Timor and Korea have been entirely ignored by the corporate media since his death, hardly covered before as well. Richard Holbrooke was also a prominent Democratic backer of the Bush administration's decision to attack Iraq in 2003.
I think Saddam has to be dealt with, and I would support an international coalition of the willing to deal with it. The fact is that we all can agree that Saddam is a truly terrible chief of state and is in the process of trying to create, and we don't know how well he's done because the inspectors have been gone for over 3 years, trying to create weapons of mass destruction.
To talk more about the legacy of Richard Holbrooke, we're joined by Jeremy Scahill, and again, staying with us, John Pilger is with us in London. Jeremy Scahill, Puffin Foundation Writing Fellow at the Nation Institute, author of Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army. In 1999, he reported daily from Yugoslavia during and after the 78-day NATO bombing. John Pilger is a longtime journalist and filmmaker who's reported extensively on the U.S.-backed Indonesian attack on East Timor, reported extensively on Iraq and Vietnam and Cambodia and many other places. Jeremy, as we're coming out of this clip of Richard Holbrooke supporting the Bush administration's war on Iraq.
Right. Well, first of all, I mean, Richard Holbrooke, probably more than any U.S. diplomat since Henry Kissinger. He cut his teeth, of course, during the Vietnam War, working under Henry Kissinger. Richard Holbrooke has represented the utter militarization of what is called U.S. diplomacy. He was also at the center of the nexus of U.S. militarists, of aggressive, hawkish, quote-unquote, diplomats, and the elite white shoe media culture. And that's why you see people like Joe Klein and others falling over themselves to engage in revisionist history about Richard Holbrooke. They only tell one part of the story, and often, in the case of Iraq or Yugoslavia, they're telling a very one-sided version of history that makes Richard Holbrooke look like something that he wasn't, and that was a peacemaker. He was a war maker and was someone who extended the tentacles of U.S. foreign policy. Under the Clinton administration, Holbrooke was sort of the hammer when it came to diplomacy, as he's been in a way under President Obama, though we'll get to that later with Afghanistan and Pakistan. Let's remember, when we're talking about Iraq, Richard Holbrooke wasn't just speaking as some pundit when he was supporting the Bush administration's lie-laden case for war in Iraq. He also promoted the idea that Saddam posed a threat with weapons of mass destruction, Richard Holbrooke. But during the Clinton administration, there were the most ruthless economic sanctions in history imposed by the Democrats on the government, or rather the people of Iraq, that just targeted the civilian population, denied food and medicine, turned the hospitals of Iraq, and John Pilger knows about this better than anyone because he did the definitive film on it, turned the hospitals of Iraq into death rows for infants. So, you know, Richard Holbrooke was part of an administration that also bombed Baghdad on multiple occasions in the north and south of the country as well under the guise of the no-fly zones.
This was during Clinton.
And this was during the Clinton administration. So then when you fast forward to the Bush fraudulent case for war, having someone like Richard Holbrooke support it is the embodiment of the continuity of U.S. foreign policy in Iraq. Clinton started the war on Iraq in full after George H.W. Bush invaded and attacked Iraq during the 1991 Gulf War, and it's been consistent U.S. policy, and Richard Holbrooke has been a staple of that policy. It was a staple of that policy.
I wanted to go back in time. I've been to East Timor a number of times during the Indonesian occupation, one of the worst genocides of the 20th century. John Pilger also did a remarkable documentary about it called Death of a Nation. East Timor is a place that was occupied by the fourth largest military in the world, Indonesia, and it started under Ford and Kissinger and went on to Carter, and Holbrooke was in that administration. A third of the population was killed. In 1997, investigative journalist Alan Nairn went to Brown University, where Richard Holbrooke was speaking, and he questioned him about East Timor.
You were the Assistant Secretary of State in the Carter administration at the height of the genocide in Timor, the years of 76, 77, 78, 79, when the killing rose to a peak. And you were the Carter administration's point man on Timor policy. You handled the testimony before Congress and so on. And it was under your watch that the U.S. sent in the OV-10 Bronco planes, the low-flying planes, which were used to bomb and strafe the Timorese out of the hills. Testimony from Catholic Church sources, reports from Amnesty International and others indicated that hundreds of thousands of East Timorese were killed during this period. And during this period, not only was the U.S. sending in these weapons which were used to kill the Timorese, but it was also blocking the UN Security Council from taking enforcement action on the two resolutions which called on Indonesia to withdraw its troops without delay. We know this because Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the former U.S. ambassador to the UN, wrote about it in his memoirs. That was the policy that started under Ford and Kissinger. Okay, and you continued that policy. So I have two questions. The first is, would you be willing to facilitate the full declassification of documents regarding what the Carter administration, your administration, did in East Timor by granting a waiver under the Privacy Act? And secondly, would you favor the convening for the case of East Timor an international war crimes tribunal along the lines of what has been done in Bosnia and Rwanda, along the lines of what President Bush called for in the case of Saddam Hussein in Iraq? And would you be willing to abide by its verdict in regard to your own conduct?
You know, first of all, we're not going to have time to deconstruct your question and take it on point by point here. We've got other questions and we need to get to them. But let me say very clearly, first of all, I don't accept every statement you've just made as fact. Far from it. Moynihan, for example, was not the ambassador during the Carter administration. He was the ambassador during the previous administration.
He started it under Ford, and you continued that policy.
I don't think we're going to have time to deconstruct this here. I do not accept most of your statements. However, in regard to the last questions, of course I favor declassification. I have nothing to hide about my own role. If I made a mistake or two along the way, I'll confront it when that comes up. No one is error-free here. But just for the purpose of everyone else in the room, this is not an accurate description of the administration's policy or my own role in it. As I said in my opening remarks, Indonesia was an important country and remains an important country. And the solution to the problem, as I said to an earlier question, does not, in my view, involve a complete arms cutoff. You're welcome to disagree. But I am interested in consequences of policy. I'm interested in solving the problem. and not...
The consequences in this case were genocide. A third of the Timorese population killed.
If you want to accuse me of genocide, you're welcome to do so. And as far as extending the War Crimes Tribunal to Timor, or for that matter Cambodia, where it's incomprehensibly not have a mandate, I'm all for it. In fact, I've recently written a letter to the Holocaust Commission at the museum recommending that they take this issue on, precisely because it's incomprehensible to me why various people who are equally as murderous as Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic have never been investigated. But I tell you here, for the benefit of everyone else, that the Timor issue is not as simple as described just now. It just isn't. This is not what happened, and I don't think anyone who knows Jimmy Carter or what he stands for would agree that this was a deliberate policy of giving low-flying airplanes or helicopters to the Indonesians so that they could go out and kill people in the hills.
That was John Holbrooke responding to journalist Alan Nairn. John Pilger, I want to play a clip from your 1994 film, Death of a Nation, The Timor Conspiracy. This is a clip of José Ramos Horta, then foreign minister in exile of East Timor, who's now the president of East Timor. He describes a bombing with a U.S.-supplied OV-10 Bronco plane in 1977, when Richard Holbrooke was Assistant Secretary of State in the Carter administration.
As the months went by, the war went on. One of my sister, Maria Zinha, by then 17 years old, in 1977, was killed during an air raid carried out by the Indonesian Air Force using Bronco aircraft. 2 American supply Bronco aircraft nosedive to a village somewhere in the remote countryside and opened fire on the village. At that particular moment, there were no guerrilla troops there, only civilian population. My sister was there. She was running the local school. She and 20 kids, at least, were killed.
That was José Ramos Horta, who became a close friend, by the way, of Richard Holbrooke. John Pilger, your response.
Well, look. Richard Holbrooke is the embodiment of rapacious U.S. policy.